Alright, so I'm just gonna rip the band-aid off right from the get-go, okay? Monsters exist. They're real. They are living in this world. You're gonna have to make your peace with that, alright? Monsters exist, and that's cool and everything. Like, they're not that big of a deal. Most of them just sort of keep to themselves. Don't cause too much of a ruckus, and generally go about living fairly chill lives. They don't hurt anyone. But just like how every single regular human isn't super chill, every single monster also isn't super chill. And there's a few of them out there who can be pretty dangerous. But don't worry, that's where Graham and I come in. My name is Dallas Wood, and for the past 3 years, I've been hunting monsters with my best friend, Graham Dalton. Although he and I have been working together to protect people for a lot longer than that. We grew up side by side, and he's the closest thing to a brother I've ever had. When we were 18, we both enlisted in the military to serve our country, although we never really saw any serious action. That all said, once we got out, we figured we had the training and the skills to still do some real good out there. And once we found out about the monsters and learned to recognize them, we figured that was the best place to apply ourselves. So we set to work, dealing with the problems that people don't know about in a way that's safe and effective. But with all that said, Graham and I can't be everywhere. The world is a big place, and there are a lot of monsters out there. So we got in our heads that it might be a good idea to share some of our experiences and help you, yes you, maximize your chances of surviving an encounter with one of the more dangerous monsters out there. And I thought that there's no better place to start than by talking about sirens. You may have heard of sirens before, or you may not have. I'm pretty sure that they're from Greek mythology. But not every siren is actually Greek, and if you just assume that, they get mad. That said, every siren is stunningly goddamn beautiful. Even the men. They're gorgeous. They generally range from cute girl/guy next door to actual supermodel. It's crazy. But you can't just assume that every hot bod you see is actually a siren, because 9 times out of 10 they won't be, and spotting them isn't easy. The obvious physical traits aren't really out in the open. Their gills are located along the ribs, under the arms, and can literally just be covered by wearing a shirt. They've got sharpened teeth that you'd think would be fairly easy to spot, but unless you're really watching their teeth, you're probably not going to notice them. Chances are, unless you're a dentist with some weird fetish for teeth, your eyes are going to be on their more interesting assets. And you won't get a good look at those pearly whites until it's too late. So then, what is the dead giveaway? Aside from the gills you won't see and the teeth you won't notice, well, I'll tell you. But you ain't gonna like it. It's in the eyes. Sirens have a certain look to their eye. Their eyes are a little more reflective, sort of like a cat's eye. If you met one in the dark, you might just see that same glow in their eyes you'd see with a lot of animals with great night vision. But as with everything else, there's a little drawback to looking a siren straight in the eye. You look a siren in the eye and you're likely to fall right under their spell. Eye contact is how they get you. I'm not a researcher or anything, so I really don't know exactly how their hypnosis works. Pretty sure I heard somewhere that it's a natural thing. Like something about their eyes fucks with your brain and makes you more vulnerable to suggestion or something like that. But maybe it's just magic. I mean, other creatures use magic. Magic totally exists, so who knows? Either way, that's the most obvious giveaway that somebody is a siren. And if that's not very helpful, I completely understand. I'm in the same boat as you. But if it were that easy to pick them out of a crowd, nobody would be getting fed on. Right. I should probably mention that sirens drink human blood. That's important to know. Now, to be entirely fair, just because sirens drink blood doesn't make them inherently bad. Most of them are content with taking what they need and moving on. They don't kill you, they just sort of hypnotize you, get you alone, feed, and move on. Hell, considering how often they use seduction to get people alone, there's a pretty good chance you'll get some while they feed on you. And I'm actually told it makes it better. Never wanted to find out for myself, but that's what I'm told. My point is, there's usually no lasting damage to getting fed on by a siren. And in most cases where somebody dies, it's because they don't handle the hypnosis well. become convinced they're in love, and start seeking sirens out deliberately. In that case, they might die after being fed on too frequently. But those are usually accidents. Usually. Like I said before, just like how every single regular human isn't super chill, every single monster also isn't super chill. That applies to sirens too. And some of them are just complete fucking assholes. Alright, so I'm going to walk you through one of our recent siren encounters and see if I can't educate you on how to properly deal with a siren encounter, should you wind up dealing with one. Comprende? Now, I'll be up front and say I ain't used to breaking things down like this. So don't be afraid to ask questions if you got them. My goal is to ensure you don't get fed on. I will also note that this encounter was something of a worst-case scenario. Not every siren encounter is going to be this bad. But hey, it doesn't really hurt to have one of those worst-case scenarios in mind, does it? Step 1. Don't look them in the eye. Alright, so Graham and I sort of knew we were walking into this one. We'd actually gotten the call a few days prior about a siren out in Montana, won't say where, by the name of Chrissy, who was suspected to be involved in a couple of recent deaths. Now, the organization we work for, the Fae Relations Bureau, usually doesn't bother with the odd death here and there, since these things sort of happen. Yeah, I know that's horrible, but we don't have the manpower to police this kind of thing. However, when a trend starts popping up, somebody's got to deal with it. We chatted with some of the locals and knew that Chrissy liked to frequent a few different bars in the county. So, we'd spent the past couple of nights drinking there. Funnily enough, one of those bars was actually where we'd had our very first siren encounter. And it was the encounter that had turned us both into the men we are today. About 5 or 6 years back, we'd been out on a fishing weekend at a nearby lake. We'd had a good evening out on the water, and we'd hit up one of the local bars to booze and have some fun. Graham had been shooting some pool, and I'd been watching the game, when this one girl with long, black hair walked up to me. She was sweet, and we flirted for a bit. I remember that the moment I looked into her eyes, I'd fallen head over heels for her. If you haven't already guessed, this lady was a siren. Anyways, we were talking, and she had her hand on my leg and everything, and she was getting all touchy-feely, and she asked me if I wanted to get out of there. Well, of course I said, yes ma'am. She'd led me outside and into the woods, and we'd started getting into it. A lot of kissing and whatnot. She'd started taking off my shirt and kissing my neck. That was when I felt the teeth. Now, I was so deep under this girl's spell that I barely even noticed the pain. I mean, I did notice it, but I didn't really react. She'd been moaning and drinking down mouthful after mouthful of blood. And honestly, I'd still been pretty into it at the time. Then, the next thing I knew, there was Graham, hooting and hollering, throwing that girl off of me and screaming at her to get the hell away. She'd backed off and she'd bared her fangs at him, snarling like an angry possum. He'd still had a pool cue in his hand and started swinging it at her. He cracked her over the head, breaking the damn thing in two, and that's when she'd run off. Now, this whole time I'd sort of been sitting against a tree, dazed and bleeding. Graham had helped me back to my truck and got me all cleaned up. I vaguely recall asking him why he'd just stopped me from getting laid, and he told me that one of the guys in the bar had seen me leave with the black-haired girl and made a joke about it. Apparently, she had a bit of a reputation. Not as a bloodsucker, but as a pickpocket. I guess she liked to rob the guys she fed on, too. Sure enough, when I looked for my wallet, it was missing. The bitch had nicked it. Graham was obviously a little more concerned about the fact that she'd been sucking my blood, and we'd gone after her the next day, although she'd never turn up. It was after that we started trying to make sense of what we'd seen that night, and eventually we ended up stumbling upon the FRB and joining its ranks. The rest from there is history. In our search for Chrissy, we actually visited that same bar. There was no Chrissy there, and apparently that black-haired girl had only been in once since the incident with us, during which she'd left empty-handed. But that was fine. We had time to search. It was a couple of days of bar hopping before we ran into Chrissy. We recognized her from a photograph our employees had provided, courtesy of another bar's security cameras. Guess they'd been installed after some of their patrons got a little too rowdy. She'd been sitting at the bar, chatting up a bartender who looked sort of like he'd walked off the cover of a romance novel. Now, I know I said that most sirens are good-looking, and I'm sure that at some point, Chrissy had also been good-looking. But damn, This was probably the ugliest siren I'd ever seen. To be fair, this wasn't a natural ugly. This was a fake ugly. Lip injections, bleach blonde hair, a spray-on tan, way too much makeup, and a leopard print miniskirt. This girl was going for what she probably thought looked hot, but just came off as trashy. And that's me saying that. I'm the first one to admit that I'm no Mr. Fancy Pants. But this girl looked like Trailer Park Instagram Barbie. Under normal circumstances, I wouldn't have wanted to talk to her. But Graham and I are nothing but professional, and after losing a quick game of rock, paper, scissors, I agreed to be the bait. So after knocking back my beer, I moseyed on down to sit beside Chrissy and started chatting her up. There's a certain technique you learn while talking to sirens. You look anywhere but the eyes. You look at the nose, which looked like it had had work done on it. Or you look at the lips, in which case you might notice the teeth. But you just don't look at the eyes. Most sirens don't notice you doing this, and they just assume that if you aren't already under their spell, you will be soon. Step 2. Don't let them know that you're onto them. Now, while talking to a siren like Chrissy, you've got to listen very carefully to what they say. She and I had been talking for a good 10 minutes or so, and she'd been going on and on like this. Yeah, I've been in this area for about 10 years now. I love it. It's so scenic. The forest's just so lovely. It's nice to get away from it all, you know? And I just sort of nodded along to everything, making small talk all the while, and waiting for her to issue what I've taken to calling a command. I don't think that sirens realize they do this, but once they're sure they've got you under their control, they start issuing little commands. Usually small ones, just to test the waters. Buy me another drink? Chrissy asked at one point. I knew that was meant to be a command. So I waved down the romance novel bartender and got her another beer. Small note, I've heard some people say that alcohol isn't good for sirens, but I've seen plenty of them drink. I'm gonna need to ask an actual siren what the truth is. Once her drink was topped off, Chrissy got to talking again, and it wasn't long before she issued another command. Let's switch to something heavier. Do you like whiskey? So, on command, I ordered us 2 shots of whiskey. Looking at her from the corner of my eye, I could see her smiling a little. She thought she had me wrapped around her little finger. Good. That's what I wanted her to think. She asked for a couple more drinks over the next couple of minutes, but never really touched any of them. She'd take a sip, then leave it. Finally, she gave the most important command. Want to get out of here? She asked. That's what I'd been waiting for. We could go back to my place, I offered. Nobody's home. I knew that would be music to her ears. Step 3. Ambush them while they're alone. If you're just looking to avoid sirens, then you can use what I've taught you so far to help you with that. But if you're looking to hunt them, then this section is for you. I left the bar with Chrissy and started walking back to mine and Graham's motel room. She had her arm around me and was being all flirty, running her hands along my arms and occasionally planting little kisses on my cheeks and neck while she peppered me with little compliments. You've got really nice arms. Do you work out? Yeah, I go to the gym sometimes, back at home. Not from around here, huh? Nah, I'm a Wyoming boy. Wyoming, huh? Never been. They got more boys like you in Wyoming? Yes, ma'am. She laughed. Guess I gotta go visit sometime. Looking back over my shoulder, I could see Graham following us at a distance. He knew what to do. I could see a baseball bat in his hands. Soon as Chrissy and I made it back to the motel room, he'd come charging in to put her down. Not fatally, obviously. A lot of monster hunters tend to go in for the kill. But Graham and I don't do it unless we have to. Good cops aren't supposed to kill suspected criminals, so we shouldn't either. We just subdue them, and then call someone to take them away. There's this facility in Arizona they've got that takes in monster prisoners. I reckon sending them there is better than killing them. As we reached the motel, I unlocked the door and let Chrissy inside. She sauntered in, looking back at me with heavy bedroom eyes and flashing me a come-and-get-me grin. Hey, she wasn't my kind of girl, but I'm still just a man. If she wasn't a blood-sucking killer, I might have been obliged to take her up on that. But then there's step 4 to consider. Step 4. For the love of God, don't put your willy in them. I think this step is pretty self-explanatory. It's a good way to get bitten, I mentioned before that I've heard the biting apparently makes it better. The same has been said of vampires. I'm not currently looking to find out for myself. Plus, I don't know what would happen if a man had a baby with a siren, and I do not want to know. So yeah, I didn't do that with the fish lady. I did pretend like I was going to, though, letting her take me to the bed and kissing her like I was going to follow through. Graham came bursting through the door about a minute later, baseball bat in hand and a crazed look in his eye. I remember that Chrissy had just enough time to look up before, bam. Job well done. She went tumbling off the bed and onto the floor, gripping her head and snarling like a wild hellcat. I'd be bullshitting if I said the sight of it wasn't a little intimidating, but I was right there with Graham to take her down. We'd done this 1,000 times before. She lunged for him, and I grabbed her and held her down. He hit her with the bat to disorient her, and I got the handcuffs. This would normally be the end of it, but Chrissy had a little trick up her sleeve. One that neither of us had seen before. She started screaming, Adam! Adam, it's a trap! Graham and I had sort of just looked at each other, wondering who the hell Adam was. Then we got our answer. The door to our hotel room had flown open, and the romance novel bartender stormed through. Teeth bared and eyes set on us. I did tell you it was hard to recognize a siren if you weren't looking for one, and it turns out that Graham and I hadn't noticed the one right in front of us. Step 5. If you run into a male siren, fight like hell. Male sirens are difficult. Here's a little lesson on siren culture for you. They tend to live in all-female communities. Why all-female? Because male sirens are difficult. They aren't as common to find as the females, and they usually tend to be more aggressive. They don't stay in the communities, partially so they can wander and keep the gene pool of several different communities diverse, and partially because if one does stay in one place for too long, the damages start adding up. They're more likely to kill their prey, or to behave in ways that are unnecessarily brutal. What this all means for guys like us is that if our work brings us into contact with a male siren, we're going to be in for an ass whooping. When Adam charged into our motel room, the first thing he did was rip off his shirt. Why did he do this? I don't actually know, but that's what he did. He ripped it off and came charging at me at full speed, leaving a Dallas-sized dent in the drywall. Chrissy took the chance to start kicking and bucking and ended up knocking poor Graham off his feet, during which she tackled him to the ground. Now, I've never seen a male and female siren working together like this, so naturally it caught us a little off guard. But Graham and I aren't chumps. We come prepared for this shit. Mostly. Adam had pulled me out of the drywall before slamming me back into it again. He ended up putting me through the wall completely and sending half of me into the bathroom. Then, of course, he pulled me out a second time and threw me across the room to mix things up a little. Through my blurry vision and the overwhelming terror of death that I currently felt, I could see Chrissy and Graham slapping and clawing at each other beside the bed. I saw him grab the lamp off the bedside table and break it over her head, before kicking her into the wall and leaving another dent. At this point, why the hell not? We already weren't getting the deposit back on the room. I tried to get to my feet, when Adam grabbed me again and slammed one big meaty fist into my face. This fist. Hoo boy. That was a knuckle sandwich with double the meat, my friend. And I don't care how homoerotic that sounds, because there's no other way I can possibly describe this. My ears were ringing after the punch to the face, and I hit the ground hard, only to get picked up again and thrown at the door onto my face. Before I was hurled out of the hotel room, I could see Chrissy on Graham's back with her teeth sank into his shoulder. He'd somehow tied the cord of the broken lamp around her neck and was trying to strangle her, although God only knew if it was working or not. Since Graham was busy and not coming to save my ass, I picked myself up off the asphalt and took a fighting stance as Adam stepped out toward me. I got off one punch that hit him in the jaw. I'm not sure who that punch hurt more, me or him. I'm no slouch, I'm no pushover. I'm a reasonably tough guy, but Adam was big. He threw another haymaker at me, but I was kinda expecting that one, and was able to duck it. My next punch went for his throat, and managed to wind him just for a bit. He took a step back, and I could see the gills on his ribs flaring. That gave me an idea. Step 6. Don't be afraid to improvise. I'm not a fan of fighting dirty, but went up against a 6'5" behemoth of a siren who was probably 90% solid muscle, you gotta do what you gotta do. So I fought dirty. And I don't just mean dirty, I mean filthy. While he was reeling from that punch to the throat, I charged him and stuck my fingers into his gills. I've never actually done this before, so I didn't know if it was going to work or not, but judging by the sound Adam made, it hurt like a son of a bitch. He screamed and drove his elbow into my skull, hard enough to make me see stars, but I didn't let go. I threw my weight against him, sending us both toppling to the ground. His head slammed hard against the pavement. I took the chance to get on top of him and punched him as hard as I could. It turns out this was not a good idea the second time, and I actually broke my hand doing this. So, for future reference, do not punch a 6'5" muscle-bound colossus in the face. Just don't do it, it's not worth it. Adam grabbed for my throat, squeezing as hard as he could, and I could see his mouth opening, revealing those razor-sharp pearly whites of his. I looked up into the motel room to see Graham standing over Chrissy as he choked her with the cord. He threw a few violent punches to keep her down, before looking at me to see how I was doing. When he saw I wasn't doing well, he came running, broken lamp cable still in hand, to loop it around Adam's throat. When that big lug realized he was being choked out, he started trying to fight off Graham, but I kept his arms busy. I grabbed one of them, using my weight to pin it down, while Graham threw his weight onto the other one. Adam was pinned, and even though he struggled, it didn't do him a lick of good. Graham pulled the cable tighter and tighter around his throat, and his struggle slowly got weaker and weaker. As he slipped into unconsciousness, I got up, stumbling a little bit to run back into the motel and get the handcuffs. Chrissy lay winded on the ground, her face covered in blood, but she looked otherwise unharmed. She didn't try and stop me as I got the handcuffs, and when I cuffed her first, she just rolled over and let me do it. I don't even think she realized what was going on. Graham had really kicked the shit out of the poor girl. Adam was still out when I brought the cuffs to him. We needed to use some of the stronger ones we had, but they held just fine. The police had shown up to investigate the disturbance about 10 minutes later. We flashed our badges, explained that these were the two under investigation, showed our warrant, and called in a pickup for the two sirens. Aside from some minor damage, neither of them were seriously injured. Last I heard, they got shipped off to Ashurst, so I hope they enjoy the Arizona weather. Graham and I, on the other hand, had taken a hell of a beating and needed a few days to recover. Either way, the job was done, and it was done right. So, there's our guide to hunting sirens. I hope that somewhere in this big wide world of ours, someone got something out of it. If not, well, we've got other monster hunting stories. Graham and I have been doing this for a while, and I've got a good feeling we'll be doing this for a long time to come. Nothing's ever going to tear us apart. Howdy, folks. Dallas here. Now, some of y'all have read our guide to dealing with sirens, and if you haven't, I don't know, go read that. Or don't. There's not really any order to these things. These are just sort of our campfire stories. And to be honest, this ghoul stuff happened before most of the stuff I talked about in my post on sirens anyways. But I'm getting off topic now. This particular incident happened back around mid-2020-ish, back before the whole world went completely and totally to shit. Graham and I had gotten a call about some pretty nasty ghoul sightings out near Big Sky, Montana. Apparently, a couple of campers had been mauled. No deaths, thank God, but somebody had to deal with the shit. Now, ghouls are a little different than a lot of the entities we deal with. Vampires, sirens, werewolves, and the odd rogue fae, they can usually be reasoned with. They aren't human, but they aren't that different from us either. Look hard enough, and you'll likely find some common ground. Ghouls, though? Not a chance. The ironic thing is, they are human. They're just way past the point where you could ever hope to reason with them. I'm actually not entirely sure how a human turns into a ghoul in the first place. That would be more of a question for the FRB research department. But I know it's got something to do with the old fae. Supposedly, anyone who pisses them off is liable to be stripped of their very humanity, until there's nothing left but a twisted body with their face and the demeanor of a rabid animal. Much as I hate to say it, there's no saving ghouls. You can't bring them back to the people that they used to be. For all intents and purposes, those people are dead. The only thing you can do is put the ghoul out of its misery. It's what's best for the ghoul, and it's what's best for the people the ghoul could have hurt. Ghoul jobs come around pretty often. There's a lot of them. And while they're dangerous, they're also usually not that eventful. It's not that different from hunting a wild animal. You track it through the woods, put a bullet in it, and photograph the body to confirm the kill. Most folks I know will burn it too, just to be safe. It's not exactly a walk in the park. Lots of good folks I know have gotten hurt or killed when a ghoul blindsided them on an otherwise routine job. But risks aside, it's still more or less the equivalent of busy work in our line of employment. That said, every now and then you run into a ghoul who really throws you for a loop. And this was one of those ghouls. Taking out the ghoul was only half the job. Graham and I were also training a rookie at the time, a kid by the name of Sawyer. He was an ex-city cop who joined up after a nasty run-in with a vampire. A lot of recruits are either ex-military or ex-law enforcement. The bosses like to hire folks with experience. Sawyer had only been with the FRB's Department of Public Safety for about 2 months, and he'd only been in the field with us for about a week. We'd run some simple rookie jobs with him already. The ghoul job was technically the biggest thing we brought him in on, but Graham and I figured he could handle it. The kid was green, but he wasn't clueless. He'd mentioned to us that he liked to hunt in his free time, and I told him this would be a lot like that. We arrived in Big Sky on a Friday afternoon to meet up with the local law and get a rundown of the situation. The DPS will usually call ahead, so the local cops know to expect us. Although I don't think most of those officers really understand just what it is we really do. They just know that we're specialists, and they're supposed to answer our questions. Every now and then, you'll run into one of the cops who knows who we are, but that's pretty rare. The cop we spoke to at Big Sky was one of the ones who had no idea who the heck we were, and wasn't entirely sure why we were even involved. I'm not really sure who asked more questions during our sit-down with him or us. "You got some witness statements from the hikers who were attacked, correct?" Graham had asked. "Of course," the officer had replied. "But they were pretty clear, whatever it was. It wasn't any animal." "Regardless, we need copies of those transcripts along with contact information," Graham said. "I can get you that. You're some sort of animal control, right? Any reason why we can't just shoot this damn thing ourselves?" "Animals like this need to be dealt with properly. There's a risk of infection otherwise. Best to leave this in the hands of the specialists." "Dead is dead. Shoot it from far enough away, you won't have to worry about infection," the officer said. "Not you, no. Other animals, though, maybe. There's tests we need to run to confirm whether or not the animal's sick. Then there's the matter of disposing of the body." "If this thing's such a problem, wouldn't the whole town be under quarantine?" he'd asked. "Son, we're in 2020. Look around and tell me how you think people are going to respond to being told they're in quarantine." That gave the officer pause for a moment. He just huffed indignantly. "Now, if you'd be so kind to bring me the files I asked for," Graham asked. The officer got up, went over to a cabinet on the far side of the room, and thumbed through it before taking out a folder. "It's all here," he said. "Every record I could find that matches up to the criteria you're looking for." "Much obliged," Graham said before taking the file off him. With that, we were on our way. "Why do they need to call us in for this sort of thing?" Sawyer had asked as we left the police station. The man had a point. Dead is dead, right? "Number of reasons," I said. "Ghouls are tricky. They're not human anymore, but that doesn't make them dumb. The whole reason mankind is at the top of the food chain is this." I tapped my noggin. "We're smart. Ghouls may be feral, but they didn't lose their brains. I've heard of them setting traps, leading people to ambushes, even using tools from time to time. It's why you never follow a running ghoul. That's probably the most important rule of hunting these things. Sure, your average law enforcement could kill one, but if they don't know what they're going up against, they're at a major disadvantage. Calling us in makes it less likely that anyone will die taking the ghoul out." "Fair enough, I suppose," Sawyer said. "Plus, I wasn't lying about there being a risk of infection," I added. "You aren't likely to get anything from your garden variety ghoul, but there are some weird parasites and shit out there. I heard back in the 80s some guy in Europe came across a ghoul infected with some sort of spore. After they killed it, his partner started acting all funny. Turns out that he'd been infected when he came into contact with the ghoul earlier. Poor bastard had to kill his own partner. And the FRB had to torch and burn this whole section of forest to get the infestation under control. Half the job is making sure there's none of that hanging around. Your average cop isn't going to be equipped to handle that. You ever see anything like that? Sawyer asked warily. I've seen some parasites. And really dangerous fungi. But nothing like what that guy in the 80s saw, I said. Just keep a level head. Follow our lead, and this will be an easy job. Sawyer gave a half nod as we got back into the truck. We spent most of Friday night going through the witness reports and called in 2 of those witnesses to meet for questioning the next day. I'll spare you the nitty-gritty of it all and just get to the summary. About 3 days prior, a group of 4 was at one of the local campgrounds. The area hadn't been all that busy on that particular evening, so they'd been more or less alone in their section of the campground at the time. They'd been enjoying their evening, roasting marshmallows over the fire and sharing campfire stories as one does, when one of them had noticed a man walking around near the building with the bathrooms in it. At the time, none of them had gotten a good look at the man, and they just assumed that he was simply another camper. The erratic way that he moved and the way he seemed to sway as he was walking was chalked up to him being drunk. Nobody seemed to have thought twice about it, until they saw the man getting closer. One of the campers, a man named Corey, had gotten up to ask the stranger what he wanted. It was around that point that the stranger had dropped onto all fours and started walking towards him. And thinking that the stranger was still human, Corey had stood his ground. He'd called out to the man a few times before he got close enough to get a good look at him. That was when he'd started screaming. The stranger had lunged for Corey, forcing him to the ground and clawing at his face, biting at him and severely mauling him. His friends had stepped in, of course. One of them, a man named Greg, had grabbed a piece of firewood and hit the stranger over the head with it several times, before they'd shifted their attention from Corey to Greg. Poor Greg had been next on the ghoul shit list. He told the police that he'd hit the thing hard enough to rip off part of his scalp before it lunged for him. And no matter how many times he'd hit it, it hadn't seemed fazed. Greg was the only one of the group who'd claimed he'd gotten a good look at the ghoul's face. He described it as pale and skeletal, with big dark eyes that he'd said looked lifeless, and tattered lips that looked like they'd been partially chewed off. When the ghoul had attacked him, he'd only barely fought it off, keeping it from sinking its teeth into his throat while his other 2 friends attacked it. Someone had gotten a knife and put it in the ghoul's side, leaving a hell of a gash, and that was when the ghoul had decided it had enough. It let out a piercing scream and tore away into the woods to escape. Greg and one of their friends had immediately rushed to check on Corey. They'd helped him to their car so they could rush him to the hospital, while the friend with the knife stood guard in case the creature came back. Then, once Corey was in the car, they booked it out of there, leaving their things behind and their fire still burning. Corey had been airlifted to a hospital where they could operate on him. From what I'd heard, the poor man had lost an eye, and would need extensive reconstructive surgery if he ever made it out of intensive care. Greg had been luckier, making it out with only cuts and bruises. Police had later found their campsite raided, presumably by whatever animal had attacked them, and neither Greg nor his friends were really able to confirm exactly what they'd seen. One of them had said it might have been a mangy bear they'd mistaken for a person. The other said it might have been some junkie. Greg was adamant that it was neither. We questioned both Greg and the friend who'd stabbed the ghoul. Both more or less reiterated the same story they'd shared with police. Greg had added that he'd seen the ghoul take off to the west, and I figured that gave us a heading. When we arrived at the campground, most of the mess had already been cleaned up. There were a few stray bits of trash scattered around the brush, but that was it. Not much to suggest that an attack had happened on the very spot we stood on. We parked our truck by the woods and got out. Graham had gotten into the bed of the truck and opened up the steel truck box we had mounted inside. He took out 3 rifles, passing one to me and one to Sawyer. "Most important thing to know about the ghouls," he said as he loaded up his rifle. "They're fast. They're mean. They're smart if you don't watch your ass. They will eat you alive. That clear?" Sawyer hesitated before giving a nod. "Good," Graham said. "First rule of ghoul hunting is that you always shoot to kill." "Shoot to kill," Sawyer repeated. "Always shoot to kill," Graham said again. "I want you to repeat that in your head 1,001 times. always shoot to kill. Because if you hesitate for 1 second, that'll get you killed. That clear?" "Yes, sir," Sawyer said. Graham nodded before reaching into the truck box again. "Second rule of ghoul hunting is that you don't go to them. You make them come to you, comprende?" "How?" Sawyer asked. "How do you think?" I asked. "What's the one thing you can offer an animal that'll make it come running?" "Food?" Sawyer asked. "Bingo," Graham said. "Which is why I brought this." From the truck box, he took out a plastic bag with something pink and yellow inside of it. I saw Sawyer squinting at it before realizing exactly what it was. It was a pig's leg. Graham drove a hook through the meat and hoisted it over his shoulder. "As soon as our ghoul smells this, he'll come running," he said. "If he doesn't smell it already," Sawyer said. "Where are we putting that thing?" "In the woods, obviously," Graham said, hopping off the bed of his truck. I closed it up for him. "Come on, let's find us a place to hang this thing. Somewhere we can keep an eye on it without our friends spotting us." I saw Sawyer hesitate for a moment as Graham took off into the woods. He looked at me, as if expecting me to do something different, but I just gestured for him to follow us. "Come on," I said. "I thought you said you liked hunting." "I like hunting deer," Sawyer murmured. "Never hunted anything like this before." "Ain't this exciting, then?" I asked. "Come on." He finally sighed and followed. After about 20 minutes of walking or so, Graham found a place to hang the meat. "Best to set up a kill box for this thing," he'd said. "There's a hill there. Those rocks will make for good shelter. Make it harder for it to flank you in case it comes from that direction. Then that tree there," he pointed to a tree behind Sawyer, "should be easy to climb. This way we got our eyes on the bait and our eyes on each other. Sound good?" "Like a walk in the park," I said. "You should take the tree. Sawyer and I will take the hill." Graham nodded and went over to the tree, while I led Sawyer to the rocks. "Seems pretty straightforward so far," he said. "So long as you're smart, most of the stuff is," I said. "Give it a year, you'll be dropping ghouls like this on your own, without breaking a sweat." "You think so, huh?" Sawyer asked. Did I stutter? I hunkered down by the rocks and reached into my pocket, taking out a pack of chewing gum. I offered a stick to Sawyer, who crouched down beside me. From our vantage point, we could see the meat hanging over the tree, and we could faintly see Graham perched on his own tree. A stillness settled over the forest as we sat and we waited. "So what if something else takes the bait?" Sawyer whispered to me. "Like a bear or something." "Simple. We shoot it," I said. "Although if there's ghouls in this area, there's a good chance we won't see any other large predators. They tend to avoid ghoul territory if they can. Not sure if it's because of the ghoul fake connections, or if they just don't do well competing against them for food. Unless the ghoul's already dead, or unless it's moved on, there's a 9 in 10 chance we'll be seeing it." "You sound sure," Sawyer said. "I've done this enough times to know," I replied. The minutes ticked by. The wind rustled through the trees. Graham watched from his tree, perched like a bird as we waited for our prey. Minutes slowly bled into an hour, and I could sense Sawyer beside me was getting a little restless, although he didn't dare speak. As the first hour dragged on, I could sense him getting a little demoralized, but I knew the ghoul was close. He couldn't hear it, but Graham and I could. The birds around us had gone quiet, and I wasn't noticing any other sound aside from the wind. Then I heard it. The snap of a twig to my left. Sawyer looked over, staring into the brush before going stiff. He'd seen it before I had. Our ghoul. It stood perched in a nearby tree, stock still and easy to mistake for a set of branches. Its skin was grayish and looked a little rotten. Its limbs were long and bony. Its dull eyes were focused on the hanging meat. But it hadn't gone for it just yet. This thing was assessing the situation as if it somehow knew it was walking into a trap. Beside me, I felt Sawyer taking aim at it. I put a hand on his shoulder and shook my head. Better to wait until it was eating, then blow as many holes in it as we could. Sawyer lowered his rifle and sat still with me, waiting. The ghoul finally let itself drop from the tree and stalked towards the pig leg. Despite having a humanoid body, it moved with the grace of a mountain lion, creeping toward the hanging meat like it was a living prey. I saw Graham readying his rifle to line up a shot. I did the same, and Sawyer followed me. The ghoul stopped before the meat, studying it before rising onto its hind legs. It swayed like a drunken man, letting out a low hiss as it did. Then it sank its dirty talons into the flesh and took its first bite, ripping away chunks of meat and chewing loudly. We had it right where we wanted it. Sawyer took the first shot, but Graham and I weren't exactly far behind. The gunshots popped off in unison, and I saw the ghoul tense up in a split second before 3 new holes were blown through its torso. It let out a pained wail and scrambled away, racing back into the coverage of the forest. Graham took another shot at it, catching it in the hip and making it stumble. Sawyer's next bullet seemed to catch it in the neck, but the ghoul didn't stop running. "Oh no, you don't," I heard Sawyer growl before getting up. He sprinted off down the hill we were on, giving chase to the ghoul. "The hell are you doing? Get back here!" I called, but he either didn't hear me or he didn't listen. He took off into the woods after that ghoul, and in doing so, he violated the most important rule of ghoul hunting. You never follow a running ghoul. "The hell is wrong with him?" Graham asked, leaping down from his tree. "He's gonna get himself killed." I didn't have an answer for that. I just went off into the woods after Sawyer. Yeah, I know, that wasn't a great idea. But what the hell was I supposed to do? Just let the boy get himself killed? "Dallas!" Graham called after me. I heard him swear under his breath before finally following. Up ahead, I heard a pained scream from Sawyer, and pushed myself to run just a little bit faster. Up ahead, I could see a rundown old cottage made of dilapidated wood. The door hung open, and in the darkness, I could see Sawyer lying on the ground. The ghoul was nowhere in sight. "Help me!" I heard him cry. "Oh God, help me!" I paused, rifle still in hand as I stared into the darkened cabin, keeping well away from the door as I did. I heard Graham coming up behind me and coming to a stop. He stared at the cabin as well, listening as Sawyer cried out for help. Neither of us moved. "Where's the ghoul?" he asked. "I don't see it," I replied. I noticed a trail of blood leading into the cabin. It had to have gone in there, although... "Something's not right," Graham said. "No shit," I replied. "Help me," Sawyer sobbed. "Please help me." His voice sounded strained from the pain, but it didn't sound quite as deep as before. Yet his body still didn't move. "What's the call?" Graham asked, looking around warily. "Not sure," I said. "He's not even trying to move, he's just laying there." "Please, God, please," Sawyer cried. "God, please." He still wasn't moving. Graham and I traded a look. I think we were both thinking the exact same thing. This wasn't right. He bit his lip, thinking it over for a moment before sighing. "God damn it." He lifted his rifle and took aim, pointing it directly at Sawyer. He hesitated for a moment longer, before he pulled the trigger. I know he hit Sawyer, but the boy still didn't move. "Please, please help me," the voice cried. But I knew it wasn't Sawyer's voice. Sawyer was already dead. "We put at least 3 rounds in that ghoul's center mass," I said quietly. "You think he's got it in him to call for help?" "No, Dallas. No, I do not," Graham replied. "Back the way we came. Rifles up, head on a swivel." I nodded and took the first step back the way we had come. That was when I saw it from the corner of my eye, about 20 feet away from us. It was in the trees, hard to see amongst the branches, but I recognized it all the same. A ghoul. Not the one we'd shot. This one had no visible injuries. This was a new one, and it was about 5 minutes from flanking us. I nudged Graham with my elbow and gestured in the direction of the ghoul. He turned his head slightly, enough to see it, but not enough for it to be obvious. We watched it make its way through the branches. It moved more like a monkey, using its slender arms to swing from tree to tree, One in the house, one at 4 o'clock, one wounded, he muttered. Well, shit. The third ghoul looked taller and lankier than the one we just shot. It paused, studying us to ensure we weren't onto it, before continuing its silent journey through the trees. What's the play? Graham asked. Starting to like that cottage more and more, I admitted. At least there's cover. And a ghoul. I make one healthy one and one wounded one, as opposed to one ghoul out in the open and maybe others we don't see, I said. How are you feeling on those odds, Graham? He stifled a laugh. Fair enough. Healthy ghoul is probably by the door, just out of sight, I said. I'm willing to bet that's how it jumped Sawyer. How thick do you think that wood is? Graham asked. Let's find out. I'll take left, you take right? He nodded and took one last look at the ghoul creeping up on us, before taking aim at the cottage. We fired at the same time, blowing 2 holes through the wooden doors. I heard an inhuman shriek from inside, and saw a flurry of movement from the left side behind the door. Guess our gamble had paid off. Graham fired 2 more shots through the door, and the ghoul who'd been hiding collapsed, scrambling away from us. We both took off at a sprint, racing towards the cabin. The wounded ghoul crawled along the ground, and Graham put 2 bullets in its head as we ducked into the cover of the worn-out wooden cabin. The ghoul who'd been stalking us remained still inside the tree it had been in, watching us intently. Then it climbed up higher into the tree and vanished. Graham and I took a moment to catch our breath, before looking around the cabin. Sawyer's body lay in a pool of blood, his throat torn open and his face fixed in a silent scream. The sight of him made my heart sink a little. The kid had shown promise. But he'd made a mistake, and gotten himself killed for it. I closed his eyes to give him some goddamn dignity. Graham studied the body of the ghoul we just killed. This is a big one, he said. Never heard one speak before, though. You ever see anything like that? Never, I said. Never known them to work in groups, either. I've heard of them pairing up, but this? I paused, before noticing the lifeless body of the ghoul who'd led Sawyer here in a corner. It looked like it had already died of its injuries. This is coordinated. They set their own little trap for us, Graham said. Jesus Christ. I reached into my pocket for my pack of gum, and took out a piece, before offering another to Graham. He took it as he stared out the dirty, cracked windows. All right, next steps, he said. That ghoul is probably watching us. Probably waiting for us to either fall asleep or try and run. I got my phone. Should we call for backup? I thought for a moment, looking out the window with him. I didn't see any sign of the ghoul, but I knew it was still out there. We call anyone, we'll be luring them into the same trap, I said. We don't know if there are any others out there. Call the local police and they'll be torn apart. We call one of our own and we're still in here for at least a day before someone gets sent out. Either way, we'll be spending the night with these things. And by the time someone arrives, either we'll be dead or they will. That's sort of what I was thinking, Graham said. So, plan B? I nodded, although only one thing came to mind. We give it a few hours, then we sleep, I said. Graham looked at me with a raised eyebrow before figuring out what I was saying. Gotcha, he said. Well, let's get to passing the time then. We moved Sawyer's body outside, along with the bodies of the 2 ghouls we'd killed. We put an extra bullet into each of their heads to confirm the kill, then texted their photos along with a status update to the office. We told them that if we didn't check in by morning, to send someone else out to finish the job. We kept a light on for a while and occupied ourselves however we could. I'm not going to lie to you. Waiting for a ghoul to come into the cabin you're in to kill you is pretty boring. And when 2 men with an intimate bond like mine and Graham's are left alone like that, with nothing but their bodies and minds for amusement, there's only a few things we can do to pass the time. Although, I guess those things are kind of fun, right? We played Would You Rather, Fuck, Marry, Kill, and, fortunately, unfortunately, over and over and over again. After a while, the sky started to get darker. I still didn't see any sign of the ghouls outside, but I doubted they'd gone away just yet. Let's kill the lights, I said. "Keep it quiet, see if they come and check on us." Graham nodded. We turned off the phone flashlight we'd been using to indicate we were still awake and picked up our rifles. Graham hunkered down into a corner beside the front door, and I took the opposite corner. We sat in silence for a while, gripping our rifles tight and waiting. The wind whispered ominously through the broken windows. Outside, it was dead silent. It was just us and the ghouls out there, waiting to see who'd slip up first. And by God, we were both determined that it wouldn't be us. The sky got darker, and the day slowly faded into dusk. From there, dusk faded into night, leaving us enveloped in total darkness. We waited, neither of us making a sound, just listening intently for the sound of movement. It took a few hours, but eventually it came. Soft footsteps approaching the rundown cabin. The ghouls were here for us. I gripped my rifle tighter, feeling my pulse race as they drew nearer. I knew all too well that this could very easily end badly for us, but this was the easiest way to do it. I heard the creak of wood as one of the ghouls stepped onto the porch. My entire body tensed as I heard it sniffing around, before watching its body step through the door. Neither Graham or I moved. We kept silent and still as the ghoul stepped inside. Behind it followed another ghoul, this one a little more stout. The first ghoul hissed as it crept into the cabin, looking around for us. I heard Graham's rifle click and the ghoul spun around, looking at him with its sunken, dark eyes. Its lips curled back in an animalistic snarl as Graham raised his rifle to its head. "Evening," he said before pulling the trigger. I watched the back of the ghoul's head pop like a balloon, spraying gore all over the ceiling. The second ghoul seemed to panic. It tried to stumble back outside, but I put a bullet in its side, earning a shriek of pain from it. It made its way out of the cabin, but I was on my feet in an instant and taking aim at it, as it scrambled frantically back towards the woods. I fired 2 more shots, and the ghoul hit the ground, twitching and gurgling as it bled out onto the soil. I put another bullet in it to confirm the kill. The silence returned, heavier than before. Graham stared out at the darkened forest, before letting out a sigh of relief. "Think that was all of them?" he asked hopefully. "I don't know," I admitted. "Guess we'll find out." We spent the rest of the night in that little cabin, listening for any other sounds from the forest. All we heard was the buzz of crickets, and come morning, the chirping of birds. We took that as a sign that we were well enough alone out there. Graham and I burned the bodies of the ghouls we'd killed, and together we carried Sawyer's body back to the truck. It seemed like the right thing to do. His family deserved something to bury. We left Big Sky, Montana that evening, after a couple of steak dinners, a toast to Sawyer, and a long afternoon nap. Frankly, I truly hope you never have the misfortune of coming across a ghoul. There's a reason I say they're nasty business, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't wonder if there was more we could have done to prepare Sawyer for what was out there. But there ain't no point in speculating. What's done is done. So I'll end this on a very simple note. If you ever run into a ghoul out there, in this big wide world of ours, it's best you leave it to the professionals. Howdy folks, Dallas here again. Hunting monsters is a full-time job. You're never really off the clock. There'll be days where things are quiet and you don't have any work. Then there'll be days at a time where you're chasing down the same slippery beast. It's never exactly consistent. As a result, you don't get a whole hell of a lot of vacation time. Which doesn't mean you get none at all, only that if you're planning a trip, it's real easy for it to get derailed. Graham and I had been planning our little trip down to Malibu for some time now. Say what you want about it, but we figured that drinking beer on the beach was the perfect way to spend New Year's. We'd loaded up the truck and were on our way down to California, when we got the call that there was a job waiting for us in Red Hills, Nevada. I'll admit, neither of us were jazzed about the detour, but we figured what the hell, right? We both could have used a bit of extra spending money, so we said we'd look into it, and look into it we did. According to the police report we got, Derek Chikatilo had committed suicide. Although why exactly a well-off accountant like him had decided to off himself was a little unclear. More importantly, the way he'd taken his own life was more than a little suspicious. According to a number of eyewitnesses, Chikatilo had been driving down the I-95 when he'd suddenly crashed his Audi into the concrete barrier that separated his lane from oncoming traffic. Then, he'd apparently gotten out of his car and run right into traffic, screaming like a madman, before getting pulverized by an 18-wheeler. And I do mean pulverized. I don't mean to be insensitive when I say this. But according to the coroner, there wasn't much of a body left to examine. His exact words to Graham and I were, "Not much of the poor bastard left but ground beef. They were cleaning him up with a power washer. Truck tore him right in two. And then what was left of him went right under the wheels." Personally, I found this description to be a little revolting. And I found myself truly, honestly hoping that Chikatilo had died the moment the truck hit him. Because I couldn't imagine a worse hell than being torn apart like that. I was admittedly a little grateful the coroner didn't allow us to see what was left of him. That shit probably would have given me nightmares. "We even sure this is up our alley?" Graham had asked as we left the coroner's office. "Guy crashed his car, got hit by a truck. Doesn't really seem like the kind of thing we usually look into." "Well, management seems to think it is," I said as we walked back to the car. "So there's obviously something about him that they're thinking is foul play." "Yeah, well, they should have told us up front," Graham said. "Makes our lives a lot easier." I got behind the driver's seat of the truck and took out my phone, checking through the case details that had been emailed to us again, looking for something we might have missed the first time. A photo of Derek Chikatilo stared back at me. He was a man who looked about as interesting as a glass of water. Short, wavy brown hair, a pasty complexion, and dull brown eyes. As far as I can tell, this guy was pretty normal. Worked at Brown and Price. One ex-wife, no kids, no past history with the FRB. No interesting police reports. Brown and Price? Graham asked, raising an eyebrow. "You worked for Brown and Price?" "Yeah, why?" I asked. "Well, shit, that's why we're on this job," he said. "Brown and Price, Henderson Brown." My eyes widened as I finally made the connection. Most people probably wouldn't have recognized the name, but I did. Granted, I'd never met Brown personally, and I would have been happy to never meet him. The man didn't exactly have a stellar reputation. Personally, I'd say the man did something of a disservice to his entire kind. Brown was a Mao, a type of cat-like fae who've got a reputation for being tricky. Casting illusions, predicting the future, and using that to sabotage you. Stuff like that. They can be dangerous if pissed off, just with the powers they're born with. But I guess that wasn't enough for some of them. Most species of fae out there haven't exactly adjusted well to the way the world has changed. But the Mao are an exception. They took to capitalism like fish to water, playing stocks, buying into companies, and amassing both wealth and power. And Henderson Brown was one of the richest. He'd wisely invested in an accounting firm, and had been sitting pretty as one of the richest Mao out there ever since. Word is, he'd even bought himself a seat on the Senate of the Imperium, a sort of informal governing board for fae and the like that our company had started working closely with. I knew folks who were taking bets on how long it would take before the vampires running the show crucified him. If Derek Chikatilo was working for Brown's firm, then his death suddenly made a hell of a lot more sense. A well-adjusted man doesn't just crash his car, then run screaming into traffic for no reason. Something needs to make him do that. And Brown employed a hell of a lot of Mao. All Chikatilo needed to do was piss one off, and they could have driven the poor bastard mad with disturbingly little effort. "So, where was his office?" Graham asked. "I think it's time we had a chat with his colleagues." I nodded before getting the address. It was time to hunt us a Mao, and step one was to find the little bastard. The office that Chikatilo had worked in wasn't too far away from the coroner's office. We drove the truck down there, got out, and flashed our badges at the receptionist. The badges we get from the DPS legally don't carry as much weight as an official police badge. Technically, nobody's obligated to let us investigate shit. And there have been a few times where we've had to carry out an investigation with an actual police officer with us. But this was not one of those times. The receptionist was more than happy to let us speak with Chikatilo's manager, a man by the name of Daniel Wallace. She led us into his office where he sat at his computer, working on something or another. Then he had us close the door and invited us to sit. Wallace was a somewhat strange-looking man. Even sitting down, I could tell he was fairly short. He couldn't have been more than 40, but his skin was like tanned leather. He had a graying goatee and poofy white hair that looked like a toupee, or part of someone's anime cosplay outfit. To a layman, he came across as just an unusual-looking man, but Graham and I recognized him for what he was immediately. A Mao trying not to look like a Mao. "So, you two are with the FRB, huh?" he asked, not even looking up from his computer. "Yeah, that's right," I said. "We're looking into the death of Derek Chikatilo." I saw Wallace pause briefly, before continuing his work, still not looking at us. "Terrible shame about him," he said. "Chikatilo was a good worker. Won't be easy to replace him. But I guess the pressure of the job was too much for him. Poor bastard must have snapped." "Were there any warning signs prior to his death that stood out to you?" Graham asked. "Can't say that there were," Wallace replied. "The man seemed quite well adjusted. This just sort of came out of nowhere." "And you don't find that suspicious?" I asked. "A well-adjusted man suddenly killing himself out of nowhere like that?" "People suffer little breaks with reality all the time," Wallace said. "Not in our experience, they don't," Graham said. "Mr. Wallace, how many Mao do you have in your employ?" Again, Wallace paused, although not for as long this time. "Not sure what you're talking about," he lied. "I'm confident that you are," Graham said. "We've already made you, and it would be easier for you to tell us than for us to go around disturbing your employees." "Gentlemen, I don't even know what a Mao is," Wallace said. "Now, are we done here? I'm very busy." I stared at Wallace for a bit, studying him and looking at the way he sat in his chair. He leaned a little to the left. I stood up, and Wallace watched me, eyes widening as I reached down toward what looked like an empty space on the armrest of his chair. Even though I couldn't feel anything, I felt something soft and furry draped over the chair. So I grabbed it and pulled as hard as I could. Fuck! The illusion Wallace had cast dissolved immediately. His twitching brown tail was ripped out of my hand as he pulled himself away from me, hissing like an angry cat. Without his illusion, he didn't look that much different. He had cat ears now, obviously, and a tail, but that ugly hair was still there. Wait, was that his actual hair and not a toupee? "What the hell's wrong with you?" he snapped. "You don't just touch a man's tail like that. Are you fucking insane?" "Mr. Wallace, I'd like to ask you again. How many Mao do you have in your employ?" Graham asked. "2, Wallace snapped. "Aside from me, and they work in HR. They didn't fucking kill Chikatilo, if that's what you're asking. They never even met him." "So you were the only Mao he knew?" I asked. "Trust me, he had no idea I was a Mao," Wallace said. "And our relationship was strictly professional. So if you'd like to insinuate that I killed him, I didn't." "Then who did?" I asked. "Because I don't think it's all that likely that his death was either a suicide or a mental break." "I don't know. There was nobody who wanted him dead," Wallace said. "You sure? What about his clients? Was he working on any fake clients?" "None. We only have a few, and those are handled by someone I trust, not him." "He didn't have access to anything?" I asked. Mr. Wallace paused, thinking again. "He might have audited the Pixie. About a month ago." "The Pixie?" Graham asked. "What's that?" "The Pixie Cat House. It's in town. It's a brothel. Got a bit of a secret menu, though." Graham rolled his eyes. "Good Lord. Please tell me you're not pimping out Faye." "Hey, I'm not the one who runs it," Wallace said. "That's another Mao." Graham and I traded a look. "Another Mao?" I asked. "We need a name." "Adriana Newman," he said. "And before you ask, I don't know where she lives. The only address we have on file is the cat house." "And did Chikatilo ever contact Newman?" "No, not that I'm aware of. Maybe he saw something off in the audit, I don't know. I doubt Newman killed him, if that's where you're going with this." "Well, right now we've got reason to suspect it was a Mao. And you're our only other suspect," I said. "So unless you feel like confessing..." "It wasn't me," he said. "We'll see. In the meantime, don't leave town. Because we'll find you if you do." With that, Graham and I left, and Wallace still had every hair on his ugly little head standing upright. We arrived at the Pixie Cat House about an hour later. We'd stopped for lunch first. Can't miss lunch. The Pixie was a pretty generic-looking building with 2 floors and hot pink paint. Once upon a time, it might have been a hotel or something. Although nowadays it proudly advertised its new business with a bright pink sign out front that read, Pixie Cat House. Have a magical time. Right beside the name was the shadow of a little fairy, laying down in a sexy pose. Graham looked up at the sign with a somewhat perplexed expression on his face. Everything all right? I asked him. Yep, he said before asking. Well, come on, Dallas. You ain't the least bit curious? Graham, we're on the clock, I said before heading through the front door. A bored-looking receptionist was waiting at the desk for us when we walked in, and just looking at her, I clocked her as another Mao. Welcome to the Pixie. What's your pleasure? She asked, putting on a fake chipper voice. We're actually here looking for Adriana Newman, I said, taking out my badge. We wanted to ask her a few questions. The receptionist's smile faded. Miss Newman is out, actually, she said. I'm not sure when she'll be returning, but you can leave a message if you'd like. That'd be great, I said, taking out a business card and setting it on the table. Let her know that she can give us a call at her convenience. We'll be in town. The Mao receptionist pocketed the card without even looking at it. I knew it was going straight in the trash. Anything else I can get you? She asked. Graham started to speak, but I cut him off. No, I said. Thank you kindly. With that, we were out again. We're not going to ask her any questions? Graham asked as we left. She ain't going to answer them, I replied, taking a hard right to make my way around the back of the building. Graham followed me. Where are we going? He asked. Looking for an office, I said. If Newman's here, that's probably where we'll find her. If not, maybe there'll still be something to find. Around back, there was a small door where I could see a well-used ashtray and a few pieces of patio furniture. Something told me that this was an employee's entrance. I pulled open the door and gestured for Graham to go inside, then followed him. We found ourselves in a quiet hallway that was clearly not meant for customers to see. There were a few miscellaneous props they'd used for decorating the lobby strewn about. A small but clean bathroom, and a small lounge with a TV and a few girls watching it. They didn't seem to notice us when we came in, and we didn't try and get their attention. Graham spotted a stairway leading downstairs and nodded his head toward it. Employees only, read the sign by the stairs. We started down together. We could hear faint voices of other girls downstairs, along with the drone of a TV. As we reached the bottom, we were greeted by a nondescript door with the same sign on it. Employees only. We opened the door and walked through, pausing when we saw what was waiting for us on the other side. A massive black shape loomed over us, turning to face us as it heard the door open. 8 legs with a black carapace so shiny it reflected our faces as it moved, as the creature before us turned to look at us. She stared down at us with 8 pitch-black eyes set in a face that looked human enough. Her torso seemed human, but everything below the waist wasn't, and though I'd never seen one of these things before, I knew what it was. An arachne. A type of creature not known for their friendly demeanor. The last thing either of us wanted to run into down here. The arachne stared down at us before slowly coming closer. Graham reached for his gun, taking a step back, knowing he might have to shoot as the arachne got closer. Then she opened her horrible mouth, and with a whispering, raspy voice said, "Excuse me, you're not supposed to be down here. This area is for employees only." Graham paused, looking up at the arachne. I'm sorry? This is an employee lounge. I'm sorry, but you can't be down here. Graham and I traded a look before deciding that if the giant spider lady wasn't going to kill us, we might as well just roll with it. I reached for my badge to show it to her. Ma'am, we're with the FRB's Department of Public Safety. We're investigating a potential murder. The arachne took my badge, looked at it, then sighed before handing it back to me. Fine, but I'm letting management know you're down here. Yeah, that's fine, I said. Thanks? The arachne just huffed, shook her head, and went back to watching TV. I saw her take out a cell phone off the table to text someone. "The fuck just happened?" Graham whispered to me. "No idea," I said, before spotting a room off to the side nearby. An office. I took off toward it. The arachne gave me a slightly dirty look, as if to slightly criticize our professionalism. But she didn't say anything out loud. She just kept tapping away at her phone, probably telling someone that we were going through the offices. Honestly, I was glad that she was doing that, as opposed to horribly mauling us. There was a laptop computer sitting on a messy desk. Whoever opened it hadn't bothered to lock it, so I got in without any issues. As far as I could tell, it didn't really look like there was much on that laptop worth protecting. Some pictures of the girls who worked at the Pixie that were meant to be uploaded to their website, a few spreadsheets keeping track of profits and the like. Best practices probably should have been to lock the laptop anyways, but then again, who would really care about this stuff? The arachne? I clicked into Outlook to see what emails had been sent or received, and looked for anything from Derek Chikatilo. Bingo. Take a look at this, I said, gesturing for Graham to come over. He did, and leaned over my shoulder as we read the email together. Newman, I've seen enough of your little freak show to know people will believe me if I leak the photos. All I need to do is send one little email, and they'll be vivisecting you and your cabaret of freaks for fucking science. So, what are you going to do to make it worth my while? Graham whistled as he read the email. Well, that's motive if I ever saw it, he said. Guess he knew more than Wallace thought he did, I said, before searching for any emails from Wallace himself. I got a few, the most recent of which was a little more than an hour old. What's this? I asked, clicking into it. Adriana, some FRB boys stopped by my office today. They're looking into Chikatilo. Keep your head down. Dan. That two-timing fuck, Graham murmured. He tipped her off. And now chances are she's in the wind, I said as I forwarded the emails to my own account, and CC'd our boss on them. Well, she can't have gotten far. Let's find her. I stepped out of the office again. The arachne was gone. As far as I could tell, we were alone. We should call the boss. Have them get the police looking for her too, I said. God willing, she won't make it out of Nevada. I'd only taken a few steps towards the door leading back to the stairs when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I looked back to see Graham staring at me, an unfamiliar expression on his face. It was an expression of pure, unadulterated hatred. Graham? I asked in the moment before his fist connected with my head and knocked me to the ground. I'd never known Graham to hit that hard in my life. I tried to pick myself up, only for Graham to grab me by the shirt and hurl me against the wall. Been waiting forever to do this, he said coldly, although his voice didn't sound right. Graham wouldn't do this. He wouldn't act like this. I knew that. We'd been friends for years. I knew him. And as he pressed me against the wall and slammed his fist into my face, I knew that who or whatever was hitting me, it wasn't Graham. I drove my fist into his ribs, making him flinch. Then I kneed that son of a bitch dead in the groin. I felt him curl inwards and took the opportunity to push him off of me. I threw my next punch at his jaw, although I left myself open for another punch to the stomach. I pushed the other man away from me on reflex, then glared at him, trying to catch my breath. Where's Graham? I demanded. The man staring at me with Graham's face just grinned and came at me again. I grabbed him, spinning him and slamming him against the wall, punching him over and over again. He wiggled out of my grasp and caught me in the temple with another punch. I took it head on, slamming into him and sending us both crashing to the ground, where we pounded on each other like high schoolers with something to prove. Where's Graham? I snarled. Where the hell is Graham? All right, that's enough, I heard a distant voice say. The man beneath me changed. I didn't recognize him now. He was bald and dressed in a black shirt that read security on the front. I looked up to see Graham a few feet away from me, with another man pinned against the wall. Then, by the door, sat the Mao receptionist we'd seen earlier, looking nothing short of pissed off. She'd dropped her facade, and I could clearly see both her ears and her tail now. In here I thought it might be fun, making you think you were fighting each other, she said. Guess you two know each other better than that. Newman? Graham asked. The receptionist smiled. Yep, she said. I was hoping you two would get lost, so I could quietly skip town. But no, you had to be an even bigger pain in my ass. You wouldn't have gotten far, I said, We've already sent Chikatilo's threats to our supervisor. They'll know you killed him. Her expression darkened slightly. I was hoping not to get the FRB involved, she admitted. But you got to admit, the bastard had it coming. He wasn't just threatening my business, he was threatening my girls. I've got people to protect. You can fuck with me all you want, but fucking with my people? That I won't stand for. Besides, according to Imperium law, I'm in the right. You two have no valid reason to continue your investigation. That's for a judge to decide. Not you, Graham said, reaching for his gun and aiming it at her. You think you can shoot me? She asked. Maybe I'm not really even here. Maybe you just think I'm standing where your partner really is. Come on. You should know the rules by now. I don't even need to be in the room to talk to you. Graham paused, before moving to aim his gun at the head of the security guard he'd been fighting. Fine. In that case, you either come quietly, or I kill him in self-defense. I knew that Graham was bluffing, but she didn't. I saw her expression soften for a moment. She was thinking it over, deciding whether or not he was really going to do it. You won't, she said. You're with the FRB. He's a civilian. He attacked us, I said. And if he ends up dead, well, I saw it happen during the struggle. It'll be your word against ours. The FRB doesn't operate that way, she snapped, although Graham cut her off by pressing the gun against the guard's head. Going once, he said. I was defending my girls. Going twice. You're not gonna... Last call. Fine. The vision of Newman faded, and she reappeared a few feet away, putting her hands up in a gesture of surrender. Do what you have to do. I'll be back here in a week. Graham nodded at me, and I got up, taking Newman's arms and slipping the cuffs on her. No illusion she could have made would change that, but I kept a hand firmly on her shoulder so she wouldn't slip away. You're wasting your time, she said. Maybe, but we're doing our job, I replied as I led her upstairs. We dropped Newman off at the Las Vegas office for the FRB. I imagined there would be a hell of a lot of red tape regarding her arrest going forward. Newman was right. Chances are the Imperium wouldn't give two shits that she'd murdered Derek Chikatilo after the threats he'd made. At best, they'd make a note that she'd killed him, and send her right back to the Pixie to carry on with business as usual. But that was fine. Our job was to find out who killed the bastard. And that was it. We'd done our job. And we'd earned our vacation. Next stop, Malibu. Become a channel member today for early access, bonus videos, and special emojis only available to members. Check out the description below or click the join button for more info. If you'd like another way to help support the channel, please consider joining my Patreon page at patreon.com/JordanGroupeHorror. As a patron, you'll get access to bonus videos and content. You'll be credited at the end of every video going forward. And if you decide to stay for 3 months, I'll name a character after you, which will be featured in a Hollow's End story. Links to join the Patreon are in the description. Thanks everyone for listening. Please like, subscribe, and comment to help the channel continue to grow. And see you again next time at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Hope you have a great night.